If you're shooting in TTL and getting inconsistent results, it's likely because you're not utilizing exposure compensation. Just like your camera, when shooting in a priority mode, it doesn't know what it's photographing, and so it's always going to expose, assuming everything is a mid-tone averaged out. So what that means is when you're photographing really dark scenes, they're going to be too bright, and when you're photographing really bright scenes, it's going to be too dark. And so what I'm going to do today is demonstrate how the flash will get things wrong and then how to correct it using exposure compensation. I originally wanted to do this by hiring 3 different models, each with a different skin tone, and then shooting up close-ups and demonstrating how the camera gets it wrong and how I can correct. However, it's a small YouTube channel and I couldn't really afford 3 models. So today I called up the modeling agency. They were able to send me just 1 model, and I'm going to adjust for this by shooting really wide shots using different backdrops so that most of the scene will be either a white, a mid-tone, or a black, and we will see how the flash gets it wrong, and then I will show you guys how to correct for it and show those visual examples. I'm waiting on the model. They'll be here any second. Oh. Actually, they're here. I'm gonna get the door, and then we'll go from there. Hey, thanks for coming. It's good to meet you. You thought it was gonna be a woman? Sexist. So let's start with the backdrop that I know the flash will get it right with, and that's the middle gray backdrop. I don't expect anything to be out of the ordinary, and I already know exactly what my histogram is going to look like. In fact, it's going to look the same for all 3 backdrops until I use exposure compensation. We'll have 1 large hump and maybe a little tiny spike on the dark side. It makes it sound like you're a bad boy. You're a good boy though. Maybe 1 little spike in the darker areas, the shadows, to accommodate for the little bit of my frame which will have Brixton in it. So let's set that up and take a look at my first shot. Let's talk about the camera settings I'm going to use. In order to shut out as much ambient light as possible, I'm going to shoot at an ISO of 100. I'm going to set my aperture to f8 and my shutter speed to 200th of a second. As far as the flash settings in my camera go, I'm going to set it to average in order to mostly accommodate for the flash and not take into consideration the ambient light. You look so handsome, Brixton. Okay, so starting off, I'm going to take 1 test shot in which I'm not using the flash just to show everyone how I'm cutting out the ambient light and only relying on the power of my flash. So after shooting a few test shots, I decided I would actually change my settings a bit so that my flash would recycle a bit quicker. But as you'll see here, it still is cutting out just about all of the ambient light. And it's completely black. In fact, I get no data at all on my histogram. So I have my middle gray backdrop set up, and I'm going to try to keep Brixton as small in the frame as possible in order to not skew my results too much. Let's take a look at how this will look without any exposure compensation. So as you guys can see, because I used a middle gray backdrop and I used no exposure compensation, I got my exposure correct. And as predicted, I have a spike down the middle where we have the middle gray backdrop, and then I also have a bit of a spike on the shadow side because of Brixton. Okay, moving on to a black backdrop, what I expect to see is not a big spike on the left, but actually a spike down the middle. As I said, the camera, the flash in TTL will assume everything is a mid-tone. And so let's take a look at how that will look, and then we'll go ahead and use exposure compensation to get a correct exposure. Now, as you can see, in this shot, the image is way overexposed, and that's because, again, the flash does not know that I'm photographing a black dog in front of a black backdrop. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead to my exposure compensation, and on the Canon flash, you simply press that middle button in the middle of the wheel and dial it to the left. I'm going to go, based off experience, about negative one and a half to get a proper exposure. Let's take a look at how that turns out. So the first shot I went with minus 1.3, and while it is an improvement from leaving my exposure compensation at 0, I don't think it was technically correct just glancing at it. The second shot is at minus 2, where because of all the blacks and the dark dog, I'm able to get a very accurate exposure. Next, let's move on to a white backdrop in which we'll see the image will actually look underexposed, and then we'll use exposure compensation to get the correct exposure. So we're here in front of our final backdrop, a white backdrop, and I expect, as said before, to have a hump in the middle, followed by a bit of data on the left side of my histogram to accommodate for Brixton here. Again, let's get our shot, take a look at how it looks, and then I'll use exposure compensation to correct it. So as you guys can see, this shot is completely underexposed and you no longer can see much detail in Brixton. I'm going to, like before, go ahead and compensate, this time going plus 1.3, but I have a suspicion that I might need to go all the way to 2. So there you have it. The plus 1.3 was a big improvement, and I think you might be able to argue that the plus 2 exposure compensation gave me the correct exposure that I'm looking for. So hopefully these examples will help you understand how to get more accurate exposures when using TTL. You may even notice that even while filming, because I'm in an auto ISO, because I have a lot of white behind me, this segment of the clip, this segment of the video is actually a bit darker than it should be because, again, the camera doesn't know what it's filming. I really hope this video helps you with your flash photography. If you want to support this channel, like, subscribe, and of course, if you're looking for some one-on-one mentorship, check out my Patreon page. I'm really happy to see that growing, and I really appreciate all the feedback I've gotten from all of you. Thanks for watching. I want to thank you for coming. I know your contract says photos only, no audio, but would it be cool if I just mic'd you up for the video? Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, that's fine.